One small cry on a bus led him to uncover a nightmare no one else saw. Henry Callahan adjusted his rearview mirror, the motion as familiar as breathing after years behind the wheel. The old yellow bus rumbled through the quiet streets of Willow Glen, Illinois, its windows rattling softly with every bump. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the windows, casting long, golden streaks across the blue-gray seats. At 62, Henry had long ago retired from his first career as a mechanic, but the days had grown empty without purpose, and when the school district posted an opening for bus drivers, he had applied without hesitation. Driving gave his life a rhythm again. It gave him people to look after, and that suited Henry just fine. The clock on the dashboard read 3:45 p.m., right on schedule. He stole a glance in the mirror, scanning the rows of children behind him. Most of them chatted animatedly, swapping stories about homework, weekend plans, and the latest social media buzz. Their laughter rose and fell in chaotic waves. But near the front, just 3 rows back, one figure sat apart. A girl. She was small for her age, tucked tightly into the corner of her seat. Her brown hair fell in loose strands over her face. Her shoulders were hunched forward, and every so often, Henry caught the subtle motion of her hand brushing tears from her cheeks. Henry's brow furrowed deeply. It wasn't the first time he had noticed her crying. In fact, it was the 3rd day in a row. Her name, according to the roster clipped to his clipboard, was Emily Parker, Class 9B. She had only enrolled at Willow Glen Intermediate 2 weeks ago. The first few days, Henry had chalked up her quietness to the usual nerves of a new kid. Some students took longer to find their place. But now, he wasn't so sure. Today, Emily's sadness seemed heavier, more consuming. She waited until the bus was nearly empty before letting her guard down, but Henry had been watching long enough to notice. She wasn't just homesick, something else was wrong. Henry called out the next stop, 5th Street, his voice steady. 2 boys hopped up, backpacks slung over their shoulders, laughing as they trotted down the aisle. They waved goodbye as they disembarked, and Henry gave a small wave back, as he always did. As the bus emptied further, Emily's quiet distress became even more visible. Henry kept an eye on her through the mirror, subtle but attentive. At one point, while rounding a curve, he noticed her bend forward sharply, slipping her hand under the seat as if retrieving something. A metallic clink echoed in the mostly silent bus. Henry's gut tightened. "Everything okay back there?" he called out, his voice casual but concerned. Emily's head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. "Yes," she said quickly, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "I just dropped my tissue." Henry nodded and refocused on the road, but unease gnawed at him. He hadn't seen her carrying a tissue earlier. And why the rush to hide whatever she was doing? He drew a slow, deliberate breath. Yesterday, he had tried speaking to her during the ride. Asked how she was settling into school. She had offered little more than one-word answers before retreating into silence. He had seen that kind of guarded behavior before. Sometimes it meant shyness, but sometimes it meant something worse. The miles passed quietly. Finally, only a handful of students remained, and Emily's stop was the very last on the route. As they neared Maple Drive, Henry made a decision. He couldn't just let this go. He pulled the bus to a gentle stop in front of a modest 2-story house with faded blue siding. The lawn was patchy, the porch in need of paint. A swing creaked on its rope in the afternoon breeze. "Last stop," he announced. Emily stood, pulling her pink backpack over one shoulder. Her movements were slow, almost reluctant. As she passed by Henry, he noticed her red-rimmed eyes, the faint, dark circles beneath them. "Have a good evening, Emily," he said, offering a warm smile. She nodded, without looking at him, and stepped off the bus. Henry hesitated only a second before rising from his seat and following her onto the sidewalk. She turned sharply, fear flashing across her face. "Why are you following me?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Henry raised his hands gently, palms out. "I'm not here to bother you," he said calmly. "I've just noticed you've seemed upset these past few days. I thought maybe I could speak with your parents, make sure everything's all right." For a heartbeat, something almost desperate crossed Emily's expression. She masked it quickly, forcing a smile. "No need for that," she said too quickly. "School's just been hard. I miss my old friends." Henry nodded slowly. "I understand," he said, though every instinct he had told him there was more to the story. Before he could say anything else, the front door of the house swung open. A man stepped onto the porch. His face was blank, unreadable. "Emily!" he barked. "Come inside." Emily froze for a split second, then hurried toward him without another word. Henry watched as the man, Daniel Foster, he remembered from the contact list, gave him a cool, assessing look. "Is there a problem?" Daniel asked, voice polite but carrying an edge of warning. Henry offered a steady smile. "No problem, sir," he said. "Just checking in. I drive the bus. I've noticed Emily's been a little upset lately." Daniel's face softened slightly, but only on the surface. "Her grandmother passed away recently," he said. "She's just having a hard time adjusting." "It'll pass." "I'm sorry for your loss," Henry said sincerely. Daniel nodded curtly and ushered Emily inside, closing the door firmly behind them. Henry stood there for a long moment, the door's heavy thud lingering in the air. Something didn't sit right with him. Maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe he was just seeing things that weren't there. But as he climbed back into the bus and started the long drive back to the depot, one thing was certain. Emily Parker was not just a homesick girl, and Henry Callahan was not going to look the other way. Not this time. The sun was dipping low when Henry Callahan pulled the bus into the depot later that afternoon. He moved through the familiar motions, shutting off the engine, logging his hours, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. Emily Parker. Her face haunted him. The way she flinched when he followed her, the quick, fearful glance she shot him before dashing into the house. And Daniel Foster, her stepfather, had been polite. Almost too polite. The kind of man who closed a conversation firmly, leaving no room for questions. Henry shook his head, trying to brush off the unease as he made his way down the aisle of the empty bus, beginning his routine sweep for forgotten backpacks, stray lunchboxes, and the crumpled homework assignments that often littered the seats by day's end. But when he reached the front rows, where Emily always paused, his eyes landed on the air vent beneath her seat. He remembered the sound earlier, the metallic clink when Emily had bent down and said she dropped a tissue. Except Henry hadn't seen her with any tissue when she left. Curiosity and concern warred inside him. Finally, caution lost. Henry knelt slowly, joints aching as he lowered himself down to the floor. The air vent was attached to the base of the seat, but as he examined it more closely, he noticed a small gap, just enough space for something to slip behind. With a quiet grunt, he reached his fingers into the narrow gap. At first, he found nothing but dust. Then his fingertips brushed against something smooth, thin. Plastic. He gently pulled it free and his breath caught. It was a small blister pack of pills, partially used. The back was printed with a brand name he didn't recognize immediately, along with dosage information. Henry turned it over in his hand, frowning. He wasn't a doctor, but he had raised 5 kids of his own. He knew enough to feel a knot tighten in his gut. Pulling out his old flip phone, he snapped a few photos of the package, just in case. Then he opened his browser and typed the name into the search bar. Within seconds, the answer blinked back at him. Birth control. Henry sat heavily in the driver's seat, staring at the pills in his hand. Birth control, hidden under the seat of a school bus, from a girl who couldn't be more than 14 or 15 years old. The implications were like a punch to the chest. He thought of her hunched figure, the silent tears, the desperate look on her face. He thought of Daniel Foster's cool dismissal, the way he had closed the door between them. Henry's hands trembled slightly as he placed the pill pack carefully into a plastic bag he kept in his waist pouch for lost items. He had found lost toys before, books, sweaters. Never something like this. He stared out the windshield for a long time, the depot around him slowly emptying as other drivers finished their routes and left for the evening. He knew he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't just assume there was an innocent explanation. Not with a child's safety potentially at stake. With a deep breath, Henry pulled out his phone again and scrolled to the contact list provided by the school district. Principal Warren Bennett. He quickly drafted a message. Found something concerning under a student's seat today. Photos attached. Requesting advice on next steps. After attaching the pictures, he hesitated for only a moment before pressing send. He waited. Minutes dragged by. No response. Frowning, he decided to call directly. After a few rings, a brisk voice answered. This is Principal Bennett. Hello, sir. This is Henry Callahan. I drive bus route 14. There was a sigh on the other end. Mr. Callahan, I'm currently in a meeting with the school board. Can this wait? Henry's grip tightened on the phone. I believe it's urgent, sir, he said firmly. I found birth control pills hidden under a student's seat today. I believe the student may be in distress. There was a long pause. I'll look at your message after my meeting, Principal Bennett said curtly. I don't like being disturbed unless it's a true emergency. And with that, the call ended. Henry stared at his phone in disbelief. A true emergency. Wasn't a frightened, isolated child enough? A slow anger burned in his chest, not hot and reckless, but steady and cold. If the people in charge wouldn't take this seriously, then maybe it was up to him. Pocketing his phone, he grabbed his bag and exited the bus. The air outside had grown crisp, and the streetlights were flickering to life. His old Buick sat waiting in the lot, the familiar rattle of its engine almost comforting as he climbed in and started for home. Except, home wasn't where his mind was. His route home passed right by Maple Drive, passed right by Emily Parker's house. And as Henry gripped the steering wheel, his heart heavy, he realized he wasn't ready to let this go just yet. Not when a child might be crying for help where no one else was willing to listen. Not tonight. The familiar streets of Willow Glen blurred past as Henry Callahan drove, his mind racing faster than his old Buick ever could. He told himself he should just go home. Clock out. Leave it to the school. Leave it to someone else. But deep down, he knew he wouldn't be able to sleep tonight if he didn't at least try to check on Emily Parker one more time. As he neared Maple Drive, he slowed, glancing toward the modest blue house at the end of the block. No lights shone from the windows, no movement on the porch. Henry hesitated, the engine rumbling softly under him. Maybe they weren't home. Maybe Emily was fine. Maybe... His gut twisted again. Just as he was about to drive on, a small figure caught his eye. There, near the corner pharmacy block, away, walked Emily. Alone. She clutched her arms tightly around herself against the cool evening air. Her head was bowed low, her steps slow and uneven, like she was fighting the weight of the world pressing down on her small frame. Without thinking, Henry pulled his car over to the curb and climbed out. "Emily!" he called softly, not wanting to scare her. The girl froze mid-step. Slowly, she turned to face him. Even from a distance, Henry could see the strain etched into her features. Her face was pale under the streetlights, her lips drawn tight. "You all right, kiddo?" Henry asked gently as he approached, keeping his distance so he wouldn't spook her. "I'm fine," she said flatly, but her body language told a different story. Her arms wrapped tighter around her midsection as if she were cradling herself from inside out. Her eyes darted past him toward the pharmacy, toward the empty sidewalk beyond. "Where's your stepfather?" Henry asked carefully. "Did he drop you off here?" Emily's jaw tightened. "That's not your business," she snapped, her voice too sharp to be convincing. "I can take care of myself." Henry raised his hands again, palms outward. "I'm not here to get you in trouble," he said quietly. "I'm just concerned. I've seen enough kids having a hard time to recognize the signs." Emily's eyes flickered with something fear. Maybe, or exhaustion. Then she staggered slightly, clutching at a nearby trash bin. Before Henry could move, she bent over and vomited violently. The sound was raw and ugly in the quiet street. Henry's heart sank. Something was terribly wrong. He moved a step closer, but stopped when she straightened and wiped her mouth with the back of her sleeve. "I'm fine," she repeated stubbornly. Her hands trembled. A middle-aged couple, out for an evening walk, slowed their pace as they approached. They looked from Henry to Emily, suspicion flashing across their faces. "Everything okay here?" the man asked, directing his question toward Emily. Emily didn't miss a beat. "He scares me," she said, voice trembling but clear. Henry's mouth opened in shock. Before he could explain, the woman stepped protectively in front of Emily. "Sir, I think you should leave," she said firmly. Henry tried to protest. "I'm her school bus driver," he said. "I was just checking." "She clearly doesn't want your help," the man interrupted, his tone hard. "Move along before we call the police." Henry saw the fear on Emily's face, but he also saw the calculated glint behind it. She didn't want help, not from him, not in public. Not where her secrets might spill into the open. Realizing that pressing further would only escalate things, Henry nodded stiffly and backed away. "I'll go," he said. But he didn't go far. He returned to his car, parked across the street, and sat behind the wheel, heart pounding. He watched through the windshield as the concerned couple continued their walk, satisfied they had chased away a threat that didn't exist. And he watched as Emily, left alone again, sat heavily on the curb, her head buried in her arms. Henry gripped the steering wheel tightly. He could call the police. But what would he say? A teenage girl cried near the bus, was sick on the sidewalk, and accused him of scaring her. Without more evidence, he would be dismissed or worse, treated as the problem. No, he had to be smart, patient. If something truly terrible was happening, and every bone in his body told him it was, he needed to be sure. He needed to catch them when they thought no one was looking. Henry leaned back in his seat, watching, waiting. Across the street, the small figure of Emily Parker wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweatshirt and stood unsteadily. And as she disappeared down the sidewalk toward the darkened pharmacy, Henry knew he couldn't turn away. Not now. Not ever. Henry Callahan gripped the steering wheel, watching as Emily Parker's small figure disappeared into the glow of the pharmacy entrance. The neon lights buzzed faintly in the cool evening air. Henry hesitated only a moment before he pulled his car forward a few yards and parked across from the store. He left the engine running, the low rumble vibrating through the steering column beneath his hands. He wasn't sure what he was looking for exactly. Maybe some confirmation of the gnawing fear in his chest. Maybe a sign that everything was fine and he could finally drive away in peace. Minutes ticked by. Customers came and went. Parents buying cough syrup for sick children, teenagers picking up soda and snacks. Ordinary faces in an ordinary town. Then he saw her. Emily emerged from the automatic doors, clutching a paper bag tightly to her chest. She paused on the sidewalk, glancing nervously up and down the street. Henry leaned forward, trying to get a better look. She wasn't alone anymore. Daniel Foster, the stepfather, stepped out behind her. Henry's stomach twisted. Greg held a plastic bag of his own, casual, in his jeans and work jacket. His hand fell heavily onto Emily's shoulder, steering her toward the parking lot. Emily flinched, almost imperceptibly, at his touch. It was subtle. But Henry caught it. As they walked to a battered silver sedan parked nearby, Henry saw Daniel hand Emily a can of something, maybe soda, maybe something stronger. She took it without looking up, cradling it close as if it were a shield. Henry's hand hovered over his phone. Should he call the police now? What could he even say? Instead, he made a quick decision. He started his car, staying several car lengths behind as Daniel and Emily pulled out of the parking lot. He would follow them. At least until he knew where they were going. The sedan meandered through town at an easy pace. They passed quiet neighborhoods, darkened diners, and closed-up shops. And then they drove past the last traffic light, heading toward the edge of town. Henry's nerves tightened. He adjusted his distance, careful not to tail too closely. After about 15 minutes of open road, Daniel's car turned onto a gravel path that led to Lakeside Parker, sprawling public area with wooded trails, picnic tables, and a small lake. In the off-season chill, it was mostly deserted. Henry parked a few rows back, killing his headlights. He watched as Daniel and Emily climbed out of the car. Daniel carried a small cooler in one hand. Emily trudged behind him, dragging her feet. They headed toward the picnic area near the tree line. Henry got out of his car, keeping low, blending into the dusk. He stayed on the walking path, pretending to stretch his legs like any ordinary passerby. From a distance, he watched Daniel spread a blanket on the grass, pulling items from the cooler. He cracked open a beer for himself and handed Emily what looked like a bottle of water. Relief flickered inside Henry. At least it wasn't alcohol. But the relief didn't last long, because even from this distance, Henry could see it. Emily wasn't enjoying a picnic. She wasn't relaxing. She sat stiffly at the edge of the blanket, her body turned slightly away from Daniel, her hands resting limply in her lap. She was enduring this. Not participating. Henry shifted slightly behind a tree, careful not to be seen. His heart pounded harder with every passing second. He debated calling the police again. What would he tell them? A picnic wasn't a crime. Not unless something happened. Not unless something already had. Just as he was wrestling with his next move, something else caught his attention. 3 men, strangers, approached the picnic area. They weren't park employees or casual joggers. They were rough around the edges work boots, worn jackets, the kind of look that didn't fit the peaceful park scene. Daniel stood to greet them. They shook hands, familiar, easy. One of the men clapped Daniel on the back, laughing about something Henry couldn't hear. The hairs on the back of Henry's neck rose. Whatever was happening, it wasn't innocent. He edged closer along the path, staying behind a line of low shrubs. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the cold fury building in his chest. He watched as Daniel gestured toward Emily. The girl remained seated, silent. And then, with a few casual glances around, Daniel and the 3 men began leading Emily toward a maintenance shed near the back of the park. A small, weathered building locked, out of sight, isolated. Henry's blood turned to ice. Without thinking, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The words tumbled out in a rush. I'm at Lakeside Park, near the maintenance sheds. I just watched 4 adult men take a teenage girl, she's a student, into a locked shed. I think she's in danger. Please send someone quickly. Help is on the way, sir. Please stay on the line. Henry crouched lower, the phone pressed to his ear, heart hammering. He watched the last sliver of daylight vanish behind the hills, and he knew, with a terrible certainty, that he was witnessing something no one else was meant to see. He had found the courage to look closer. Now he prayed it wasn't too late. Henry Callahan crouched low behind a cluster of trees, the phone pressed tightly to his ear, his knuckles white from gripping it so hard. Across the field, the maintenance shed loomed in the growing dusk, its battered door locked behind the figures he had just seen slip inside. The dispatcher's voice buzzed in his ear. Officers are en route, sir. ETA approximately 6 to 8 minutes. Can you maintain visual contact without approaching? Henry's throat was dry, but he forced the words out. I can see the building, he whispered. I'll stay hidden. Good. Stay on the line if you can. Henry nodded, even though she couldn't see him. He shifted slightly, adjusting his position to keep the shed in view. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to do something. To charge in, to pull that door open, but he knew better. He wasn't a cop. He didn't know what was waiting inside. If he rushed in and got hurt or worse, there'd be no one left to help Emily. Minutes dragged by like hours. He strained his ears, trying to hear anything, voices, movement, anything at all. A muffled sound floated across the air. He couldn't make out words, but he could hear the tone. Sharp, commanding, ugly. He closed his eyes for a moment, willing himself to stay calm. Just hang on, kid, he murmured under his breath. Help is coming. Suddenly, footsteps crunched behind him. Henry whirled, heart leaping into his throat. 2 men in running clothes stood there, both about his age, both looking suspiciously from him to the shed. What are you doing out here, man? One of them asked, wary. Henry didn't hesitate. There's a girl in that shed, he said urgently. 4 men. I called 911. Cops are on the way. The runners exchanged glances. One of them, A tall man with a weathered face stepped closer to the shed, squinting. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," Henry said. "Please, just stay back until the police get here." The other jogger shook his head grimly. "We can't just stand here." He started forward, fists clenched. Before Henry could argue, they were already pounding on the shed door. "Hey, open up!" one of them shouted. Inside, there was a sudden burst of movement. Henry could hear scuffling, raised voices, and then clear and desperate Emily's voice. "Help, please, help me!" The sound tore through Henry like a knife. The joggers pounded harder. "Open the door!" they bellowed. In the distance, sirens wailed closer now, growing louder by the second. Henry darted forward, but stayed behind the joggers, heart hammering. Seconds later, 2 police cruisers skidded into the parking lot, lights flashing, tires throwing gravel. Officers poured out, weapons drawn. "Police." "Step away from the door," one officer barked. The joggers backed off, hands raised. The officers moved in with practiced speed, one pulling out a heavy metal ram from the trunk, another covering the door with his firearm. A sharp crack split the air as the battering ram shattered the weak door frame. "Hands where we can see them! On the ground!" an officer shouted. 3 men stumbled out first, hands up, faces pale. Henry recognized Daniel Foster immediately, his mouth twisted in a furious sneer. Behind them, pressed against the back wall, was Emily. She was huddled into herself, her sweatshirt pulled tightly around her body, tears streaking down her face. "Step away from the girl," a female officer commanded sharply. Daniel hesitated, his hands twitching at his sides. "Step away now," the officer repeated, raising her voice. With a sneer of contempt, Daniel dropped his hands to his sides and stepped backward. Officers surged forward, cuffing him roughly and dragging him out into the open. Henry caught a glimpse of Emily's face, then raw fear, overwhelming relief, and his heart broke all over again. The officers moved swiftly, securing the other men. A female officer knelt beside Emily, speaking softly, shielding her from view with her own body. Henry let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was over. Or at least, the worst part was. One officer approached him quickly. "Sir, you the one who called this in?" "Yes," Henry rasped. His voice was rough with emotion. "Stay right here, we'll need your statement." Henry nodded, unable to take his eyes off Emily. She was sitting now, a blanket wrapped around her thin shoulders, rocking slightly as the female officer spoke to her in soothing tones. Across the parking lot, Daniel Foster sat cuffed in the back of a cruiser, shouting something unintelligible, his face twisted in rage. But no one was listening to him anymore. Henry wiped his face with the sleeve of his jacket, realizing only then that he was crying too. He didn't care. He had seen too much pain ignored in his lifetime. He had watched too many people look away when something wasn't their problem. But not this time, not today. He had listened. He had acted, and because of that, a child was safe. For the first time all evening, a deep, steady sense of peace settled over Henry Callahan. He had done the right thing. And he knew deep down he would do it again 1,000 times over. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted the trees and the gravel lot in shifting color. The sun had disappeared completely now, leaving only a deepening twilight and the growing chill of an autumn night. Henry Callahan stood near his old Buick, arms crossed against the cold, as the officers moved methodically around the scene. A paramedic team had arrived minutes earlier, and now hovered protectively near Emily Parker. She sat on the back of an ambulance, bundled tightly in a blanket, her small frame trembling more from exhaustion than from the cold. Henry watched as one of the paramedics knelt before her, checking her pulse, speaking in a low, calming voice. A woman approached him. Soft-spoken, steady figure wearing a dark jacket with the words Child Protective Services stitched neatly over her heart. "Mr. Callahan?" she asked. He nodded. "I'm Linda Hayes, social worker assigned tonight. First, thank you for what you did. If you hadn't called when you did—" She trailed off, shaking her head. Henry offered a tired smile. "Just doing what anyone should have done." "Sadly," she said gently, "not everyone does." They stood in silence for a moment, both watching Emily, who now seemed to be answering a few quiet questions from a female officer. Linda turned back to Henry. "I'll be accompanying Emily to the hospital for a full evaluation," she said. "Physical and psychological. Standard procedure after a situation like this." Henry nodded. "Good. She needs people she can trust right now." "Would you—" Linda hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Would you mind riding with us? Just until we get her settled? She keeps looking toward you. You might make her feel safer." Henry's throat tightened unexpectedly. "Of course," he said, voice rough. Minutes later, Henry found himself sitting quietly in the passenger seat of the ambulance, while Emily and Linda occupied the back. The ride to Willow Glen Memorial Hospital was short, but every bump and rattle seemed to stretch the minutes painfully. Henry glanced back once. Emily met his gaze. Her eyes were wide, glassy, still raw from everything she had endured, but there was something else there too. Trust. For the first time since he had met her, she wasn't shrinking away. She was holding on. At the hospital, a flurry of quiet, professional activity surrounded them. Nurses moved quickly, guiding Emily into an exam room. A pediatrician arrived, speaking in soft, measured tones. Linda stayed close, never letting the girl feel alone. Henry sat in the waiting area, wringing his hands slowly, his knees bouncing with restless energy. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and overbrewed coffee. The overhead lights buzzed faintly. Other families drifted in and out, dealing with broken arms, high fevers, late-night accidents. Life went on around them. But for Henry, the world had narrowed to a single focus, making sure Emily was safe. A young officer approached after some time, a woman he remembered from the scene at the park. "Mr. Callahan," she said warmly, "we've finished processing your initial statement, but we'll probably need a full written report later this week." "Of course," Henry said. The officer hesitated. "I thought you should know Daniel Foster has been officially charged," she said. "Multiple counts, and he won't be getting out on bail." Henry felt a wave of grim satisfaction. "Good," he said simply. The officer nodded, then softened. "And one more thing. Emily asked if you're still here. She wants to see you." Henry stood immediately, his joints protesting, but his spirit lighter than it had been in days. The officer led him down a maze of beige corridors to a small private room. He hesitated at the door. Inside, Emily sat on the bed, dwarfed by the oversized hospital gown she wore. Her hair was messy, her cheeks flushed. But when she saw him, a shy, hesitant smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. Henry stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. "Hey, kiddo," he said gently. "Hi," she whispered. He sat down carefully in the chair beside her bed, unsure how close was too close. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "Thank you," she said, her voice cracking on the second word. Henry shook his head. "You don't have to thank me, Emily," he said softly. "I just paid attention. You did the hard part." She sniffled and wiped her nose on the edge of the blanket. "I thought nobody would notice," she said, "that nobody would care." Henry felt a lump form in his throat. "Well," he said, voice thick with emotion, "you were wrong." He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "Sometimes it feels like no one's paying attention," he said, "but there are people out there who see you, who care. Who would move heaven and earth to keep you safe?" He paused. "And I promise you this, Emily, you are not alone anymore." Tears welled up in her eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of something else. Relief, hope. Linda Hayes peeked in the door, smiling softly at the sight of them. "I'll give you two a few more minutes," she said kindly. As the door clicked shut again, Emily pulled the blanket tighter around herself and looked at Henry with an earnestness that broke his heart all over again. "Will you stay a little longer?" she asked quietly. Henry smiled. "As long as you need," he said. And for the first time in a long time, for both of them, the night felt a little less dark. The quiet hum of the hospital surrounded them. Henry Callahan sat in the chair beside Emily Parker's hospital bed, watching over her like a sentry. He didn't speak much, he simply stayed, steady and silent, the way a lighthouse holds its place in a storm. After a while, Emily drifted into a light sleep, her breathing shallow but even. Henry leaned back, letting the chair creak beneath his weight, his body aching from the long day. Yet he didn't mind. Pain he could handle. It was helplessness that gnawed at him most. A soft knock at the door stirred him. He rose as Linda Hayes, the social worker, slipped inside. Behind her stood a woman in a white coat, a stethoscope draped around her neck. "Mr. Callahan," Linda said gently, "this is Dr. Evelyn Brooks. She's been overseeing Emily's care." Henry offered a tired smile and shook the doctor's hand. "Thank you for taking care of her," he said. Dr. Brooks smiled warmly, but there was a seriousness behind her eyes. "Can we talk outside for a moment?" she asked. Henry glanced at Emily, still sleeping. He nodded and followed them into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind them, muffling the beeping monitors and quiet conversations that filled the hospital floor. Dr. Brooks took a deep breath. "I wanted to update you on Emily's condition," she began. "Physically, she's stable. Dehydrated, exhausted, and very stressed, but we're addressing all of that." Henry's shoulders sagged in relief. "But there's something else," Dr. Brooks continued, her voice softening. Henry felt his chest tighten. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Callahan, Emily is pregnant." The words landed heavy in the sterile corridor, sucking the air from Henry's lungs. He blinked, as if trying to make sense of what he had just heard. Pregnant. A child carrying a child. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering himself before he spoke. "How far along?" he asked quietly. "Very early," Dr. Brooks said. "Just a few weeks, likely. Based on her symptoms and initial blood work, we estimate less than 2 months." Henry rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the scratch of stubble against his palm. Does she know yet? Dr. Brooks shook her head. We haven't told her. We were waiting for her mother to arrive. Henry nodded slowly. And has her mother been contacted? Yes, Linda Hayes answered. Susan Parker and Emily's grandmother, Margaret Parker, are on their way now. They should be here within the hour. Henry leaned against the wall, feeling its coolness seep through his jacket. He thought about Susan expecting a new baby of her own, trusting her daughter in the care of the wrong man. He thought about Emily, so young, so scared, forced into a nightmare she never should have known. I'll stay, Henry said, his voice rough but steady. I'll be here when they come. Linda smiled gently. I think that would mean a lot to Emily. Time passed in slow, aching minutes. Henry sat back in the chair beside Emily's bed, watching as she stirred awake. Her eyelids fluttered open, confused at first, then settling when she saw him still there. Hey, kiddo, he said softly. She gave him a small, brave smile. Did you go home? She asked groggily. Not a chance, he said. A faint giggle escaped her lips, barely more than a whisper, but it was there, and it was real. Moments later, the door burst open. A woman rushed in, her face pale with worry, her heavily pregnant body moving with surprising speed. Emily, she cried, tears already streaming down her cheeks. Susan Parker gathered her daughter into her arms, holding her so tightly it seemed she might never let go. I'm so sorry, baby, Susan whispered over and over. I'm so sorry. Henry stood quietly, stepping back to give them space. Behind Susan, Margaret Parker entered, a pillar of strength despite the grief etched deep in her features. She placed a hand on Henry's shoulder, squeezing it firmly. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for saving our girl. Henry shook his head, overcome with emotion. I just noticed, he said simply. I just didn't look away. Dr. Brooks entered then, her expression somber but professional. Mrs. Parker, she said gently, there's something we need to discuss privately. Susan paled, her arms tightening around Emily. Margaret stepped forward. We're family, she said firmly. You can say it. Dr. Brooks hesitated only a second before speaking. Emily is pregnant, she said softly. The room seemed to tilt. Susan swayed, gripping the bedrail to steady herself. Margaret gasped quietly, covering her mouth with her hand. Emily looked up at her mother, confusion clouding her features. Pregnant? She repeated, the word foreign and terrifying on her tongue. Susan crumpled into the chair beside the bed, tears streaming anew. Henry moved to Margaret's side, offering silent support. No, 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 Susan whispered, shaking her head. She's just a child. I'm so sorry, Dr. Brooks said. But we'll walk through this together. There are options. There's help. Emily looked between them, her face crumpling. I didn't mean for this to happen, she sobbed. I just wanted it to stop. Susan pulled her close again, rocking her gently. This is not your fault, Susan said fiercely. None of this is your fault. You hear me, Emily? Henry blinked rapidly, his throat thick with emotion. In the raw grief of that hospital room, in the crushing realization of what had been stolen from them, something else emerged too. A fierce, unbreakable bond. A vow unspoken between mother and daughter, grandmother and granddaughter. They would fight for her. They would not let this define her. And Henry Quiet, Steady Henry knew he would stand beside them, however he could, for as long as he was needed. Because when you see a child hurting, you don't just walk away. Not if you have any decency left in you. Not if you still believe that one person, paying attention, can change everything. The hospital room was heavy, with a silence that felt almost sacred. Susan Parker clung to her daughter, whispering soft words of reassurance into Emily's tangled hair. Margaret stood nearby, her hands wringing the hem of her cardigan, her face pale but resolute. Henry Callahan stayed by the door, giving the family space but refusing to leave. Dr. Evelyn Brooks and Linda Hayes, the social worker, stood quietly near the window, ready to offer help, but wise enough to know that this moment belonged to the family first. After a long while, Emily shifted slightly in her mother's arms. She pulled back, wiping her tear-streaked face with the sleeve of her hospital gown. Her hands trembled. "I need to tell you," she said hoarsely, her voice so small it barely carried across the room. "I need to tell you what happened." Susan gently took Emily's hand in both of hers, bracing herself. "We're listening, baby," she said softly. Emily took a deep, shuddering breath. "It started about a month ago," she whispered. "After Mom went to stay with Grandma, Greg said it was my fault he was lonely." Susan closed her eyes briefly, fighting back a fresh wave of anguish. Emily stared at her hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "He told me if I didn't let him." Her voice broke, and she drew a ragged breath. "He said he'd hurt the baby, the one Mum's having." Margaret gasped audibly. Henry felt his stomach twist in rage. "He told me nobody would believe me," Emily continued, her words tumbling out now in a rush, "that if I told anyone, Mum would blame me and never want me again." Tears spilled down Susan's cheeks as she leaned closer. "That's not true," she said fiercely. "None of that is true, Emily." Emily shook her head violently, pain and shame written across every line of her young face. "I tried to make it stop," she cried. "I hid the pills. I didn't even understand them. One of the girls at school said they could stop it. I didn't know how anything worked. I just didn't want to be pregnant." She looked up then, her brown eyes wide with desperate sorrow. "I didn't want to be pregnant," she repeated, as if saying it out loud might change the truth. Susan gathered her daughter into her arms again, rocking her gently. "You did nothing wrong," she whispered. "Nothing." Margaret knelt beside them, wrapping one strong, shaking hand around both Susan and Emily's. For a while, no one said anything more. There was only the sound of quiet weeping and the muted beeping of monitors outside the door. Finally, Dr. Brooks stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "We need to discuss next steps," she said. "Emily will need medical care, counseling, and ongoing support. And there are decisions to make about the pregnancy." Susan nodded slowly, though her hands tightened around Emily's small body as if to shield her from any more pain. "I want what's best for her," Susan said, her voice raw. "Whatever she wants, whatever she needs, we'll find a way." Linda Hayes pulled a chair closer. "There are options," she said carefully, "and Emily will be part of every decision. She'll have choices. No one will force anything on her." Henry stayed silent, letting the family process the flood of information now cascading down on them. But inside, he burned with quiet fury at what had been done to this girl. And he truly marveled at her strength, at her courage to survive, at her willingness to speak when so many would have stayed silent. After a long discussion, with Dr. Brooks answering every question patiently and thoroughly, Susan and Margaret made it clear. They would stand beside Emily no matter what. They would not hide her or shame her. They would not let Greg Foster's crimes define her life. As the professionals gave them privacy to talk, Henry stepped quietly into the hallway. He leaned against the wall, staring at the floor, his mind still reeling. How many times in his life had he missed signs like this? How many kids had been crying out in silence while the world hurried past? Henry knew he couldn't change the past. But he also knew one thing for certain. He would never look away again. He would never assume it was someone else's problem to solve, because sometimes noticing mattered. Sometimes paying attention saved lives. And tonight, in the quiet halls of a small-town hospital, a man who had once thought his best years were behind him realized something unexpected. He had just done the most important work of his life. The early morning light crept into the hospital corridors, casting long, soft shadows across the polished floors. Henry Callahan sat slumped in a waiting room chair, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling in his hands. His body ached, his eyes burned from lack of sleep. But he stayed. Down the hallway, behind a closed door, Susan Parker and Margaret Parker sat with Emily, holding her close as they gently navigated the impossible decisions that lay before them. No one had asked Henry to stay. But no one had to. He wasn't leaving. Not until he knew they didn't need him anymore. A soft scuff of shoes broke the quiet, and Henry looked up to see Linda Hayes approaching, a clipboard tucked under her arm. "Morning, Mr. Callahan," she said warmly. "Morning," he rasped. She sat in the chair beside him, her voice low and careful. "They've made some decisions," she said. "And Emily asked if you would be there when we go over everything." Henry blinked back the sting in his eyes. "Of course," he said. Together, they walked back to Emily's room. Inside, Susan looked up from where she sat beside her daughter's bed. Margaret stood at the foot of the bed, her arms crossed protectively across her chest. Emily, still small and fragile in her hospital gown, gave Henry a shy smile when he entered. He nodded at her, giving her a small, reassuring smile in return. Dr. Evelyn Brooks was already there, seated beside Linda, ready to guide them through the process. Susan took a breath, her voice steady but soft. "Emily and I have talked," she said, "and we've decided." She reached for her daughter's hand, squeezing it gently. "We're going to terminate the pregnancy," Susan continued, her voice breaking slightly. "Emily is too young, too hurt. She deserves the chance to heal, to be a child again." Emily looked down at her hands, her voice a whisper. "I want to go back to school. I want to see my friends again. I don't want to carry this with me forever." Henry felt a lump rise in his throat. He nodded slowly, offering nothing but support. "Doctor." Brooks explained the next steps: appointments, counseling, follow-up care. Everything would be handled with dignity, privacy, and compassion. And through it all, Susan and Margaret made it clear. Emily would not walk this road alone. Later that morning, after the paperwork had been completed and the immediate crisis had been stabilized, the conversation shifted to what came next. "We're going to move," Susan said firmly, her hand never leaving Emily's. "Somewhere fresh." "Somewhere safe?" Margaret nodded her agreement. "And we're getting counseling," Susan added. "For Emily. For me. For all of us." Henry leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're doing the right thing," he said. Susan smiled, weary but grateful. "And Emily has asked—" She hesitated, glancing at her daughter. Emily looked at Henry, her brown eyes clear for the first time in days. "Would you still drive the bus?" she asked shyly. "Next year? When I'm ready to go back?" Henry chuckled softly, the sound rough with emotion. "If they'll let me," he said, "I'll drive that bus as long as you need me." Emily's smile widened just a little, a real smile, fragile but growing. As the hospital staff came and went, preparing discharge papers and arranging transportation, Henry found himself stepping back into the hallway once more. He leaned against the cool wall, letting the relief wash over him. It wasn't over. Healing would take time. There would be dark days ahead, doubts and struggles, and nights full of questions with no easy answers. But for the first time, hope felt real. The kind of hope that comes not from pretending everything is fine, but from surviving, from standing together, from choosing to keep moving forward even when the road is steep. Henry watched through the window as Susan hugged Emily tightly, as Margaret packed a small bag of the girls' belongings, as Linda Hayes smiled warmly and made notes on her clipboard. Life had shattered for this family, but they were piecing it back together, shard by shard. And in the quiet corridors of a small-town hospital, Henry Callahan realized something he hadn't known he was missing. A sense of purpose, a second chance to make a difference, not just by fixing engines or driving kids home from school, but by noticing, by listening, by standing up when it mattered most. And somehow, that was enough. More than enough. Weeks passed. The heavy grey clouds that had seemed to settle over Willow Glen that terrible night began, slowly, to break apart. Henry Callahan continued driving bus route 14 each morning and afternoon, though the route felt different now. He glanced often at the front rows, half expecting to see Emily Parker's quiet form hunched over her backpack. But Emily wasn't ready to return yet, and Henry understood. Healing didn't follow a schedule. It moved at its own stubborn, fragile pace. Still, every so often, he would get updates. A phone call from Linda Hayes telling him Emily was doing better in her counseling sessions. A quick wave from Susan Parker when he passed the grocery store, her arms full of baby supplies and her belly smaller now, post-delivery. Emily's baby brother had arrived earlier. Healthy, squalling bundle of new beginnings. And though life would never be the same for the Parkers, it was moving forward. One sunny Saturday in early spring, Henry's old Buick rumbled into the hospital parking lot. Not for an emergency this time. Today was a day of small celebrations. Henry made his way inside, nodding at nurses he now knew by name, and found himself standing outside a small meeting room tucked near the pediatric wing. A sign on the door read, "Family Counseling, Graduation Day." He hesitated for just a second, smoothing his jacket awkwardly. Then he pushed open the door. Inside, a dozen or so people sat in a loose circle. Some were children. Some were parents. Some, like Henry, were the unlikely allies who had refused to walk away. And there, near the window where sunlight streamed in, sat Emily. She looked different now. Still small, still quiet, but there was a strength in her posture, a steadiness in the way she lifted her chin to meet his gaze. She smiled when she saw him. Not a shy, trembling smile, but a real one, warm, certain. Henry's heart lifted. He took a seat near the back as Linda Hayes stood up and addressed the room. "Today," she said, "we honor resilience." Her voice carried clearly, filling the little space with something that felt almost holy. We honor the courage to speak the truth, the courage to survive, the courage to rebuild a life. Henry listened as each family shared a few words about their struggles, their hopes, their next steps. When it was Emily's turn, she rose slowly to her feet, Susan and Margaret beaming up at her with pride. "I just want to say," Emily began, her voice steady, "thank you to everyone who helped me, who believed me." She glanced toward Henry, her eyes bright, "and to people who paid attention when it would have been easier to look away." Henry felt a lump rise in his throat. After the ceremony, as people gathered for coffee and cookies, Emily made her way over to him. She stood in front of him, clutching a paper certificate in her hands. "You were the first person who noticed," she said. Henry chuckled softly. "I was just an old man doing his job," he said. Emily shook her head firmly. "You were the first person who cared." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small keychain, something handmade from colored beads. "For you," she said, pressing it into his hand, "to hang on your bus keys." Henry looked down at the simple gift, his vision blurring. "I'll treasure it," he said gruffly. Susan and Margaret approached, each giving him a warm hug. "Thank you," Susan whispered again, "for seeing her, for saving her." Henry nodded, unable to find words big enough to fit the moment. Later, as he climbed back into his Buick, he held the little keychain up to the sunlight. It sparkled in a dozen colors. Hope, forgiveness, new beginnings. That night, as he pulled the big yellow bus into the depot after his route, he attached the keychain to his bus keys. It swung lightly, catching the last golden rays of the setting sun. Henry Callahan smiled to himself as he locked the bus and headed home. Sometimes, it's not the grand gestures that save a life. Sometimes, it's a quiet man noticing a quiet girl on a quiet afternoon. Sometimes, it's simply refusing to look away. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything. Spring turned to summer in Willow Glen, and with it came the slow, steady hum of ordinary life. For Henry Callahan, that meant early mornings warming up the old school bus, watching the sleepy kids shuffle aboard with their backpacks half open and sneakers untied. It meant waving at the crossing guard, dodging potholes along Elm Street, and hearing the familiar chorus of chatter fill the rows behind him. But something was different now. Henry had changed. The way he looked at the world had changed. He noticed more, not just the big things, but the small ones. Tooth-quiet sadness behind a child's smile, the stiffness in a student's shoulders, the glances that said more than words ever could. And he paid attention. He knew what could happen when you didn't. One warm afternoon in July, Henry found himself at Willow Glen Park, setting up folding chairs under the big oak trees near the playground. Today was a celebration, nothing fancy, just neighbors and families gathering for a potluck picnic organized by the community center. And today, the Parker family would be there. It was the first time Emily would be out among the neighborhood kids again since everything had happened. Henry spotted them arriving just after noon. Susan carried a picnic basket in one arm and cradled her new baby boy in the other. Margaret trailed behind, waving cheerfully, carrying a blanket and a diaper bag. And Emily, sweet, brave Emily, walked between them, her stride small but sure. Henry smiled as he watched Susan set up a spot near the playground, spreading the blanket out and settling the baby carefully onto it. Emily stood for a moment, uncertain. Henry rose from his folding chair and made his way over. "Hey there, kiddo," he said warmly. Emily's face lit up. "Hi, Mr. Callahan. You ready to dominate the three-legged race later?" he teased. Emily giggled, a sound so pure it tugged at Henry's heart. "I might need a faster partner," she said, glancing mischievously at him. Henry chuckled. "I think I still have a little speed left in these old legs," he said, patting his knee dramatically. "But fair warning, I'm known for tripping over my own feet." Emily laughed, a real, easy laugh. Susan and Margaret watched from their picnic spot, smiles on their faces, gratitude shining in their eyes. As the afternoon unfolded, Henry saw something miraculous happen. Emily played. She ran the sack race, even when she stumbled and fell. She built sandcastles with younger kids at the edge of the playground. She took a turn swinging, the breeze whipping her hair back, her face tilted up toward the wide, forgiving sky. Henry sat back in his chair, sipping a lemonade someone had thrust into his hand, and watched her. This was healing, he realized. Not the kind that happened in hospital rooms or therapist offices, though those were important too, but the kind that happened under open skies, with laughter, with the small victories of ordinary days. Later, as the sun dipped low and families began packing up their blankets and baskets, Emily came to sit beside him. Her face was flushed from running, and she had a smear of chocolate on her chin from a melted brownie. She didn't say anything at first, just sat there, shoulder to shoulder with him, comfortable now in a way that would have been impossible months earlier. Finally, she spoke. "I'm happy," she said simply. Henry turned to look at her, his heart full. "I'm glad, Emily." She looked up at him, her brown eyes shining. "Because of you." Henry shook his head gently. "Because of you," he corrected. "You're the one who was brave." Emily smiled, a little shy, a little proud, and leaned her head against his arm briefly before pulling away. "I start school again in the fall," she said, twirling a blade of grass between her fingers. "Not Willow Glen. Mom's enrolling me at Brookside Academy. Fresh start." Henry nodded. "Sounds perfect." "I'm a little scared," she admitted. He smiled. "That's okay. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing it anyway." She grinned. "I'll remember that." As the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the trees, Henry Callahan watched Emily Parker laugh and run and play, her steps light again, her heart just a little less burdened. Life would never erase what she had endured. But it would not be defined by it either. And as for Henry, he had found something too, a reminder that even in a world full of brokenness, small kindnesses mattered. Noticing mattered. Showing up mattered. And sometimes, the greatest difference you could make came simply from being willing to care. By late August, the heat of summer had begun to loosen its grip on Willow Glen. The days were still warm, but the evenings carried a whisper of cooler air, a subtle promise of fall. Henry Callahan sat at the small cafe downtown, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him as he watched the sidewalk through the window. He wasn't expecting company. He wasn't hoping for anything, really. Sometimes he just liked being near people, watching the ordinary rhythms of life continue, a kind of gentle reassurance that the world, for all its sorrows, still moved forward. The bell over the door jingled. Henry glanced up out of habit and nearly smiled out loud. It was Susan Parker. And right behind her, carrying a pink and purple backpack slung casually over one shoulder, was Emily. Henry stood quickly, his chair scraping against the floor. Susan gave him a warm smile as she approached. Mind if we join you? She asked. Please, Henry said, his voice thick with surprise and gratitude. They settled into the booth across from him. Emily slid in first, grinning shyly. She looked so different now, stronger. Still delicate in some ways, but no longer fragile. There was a steadiness to her, a quiet kind of courage that shone in her eyes. Susan ordered a lemonade for Emily and a coffee for herself. When the waitress wandered off, Susan leaned forward slightly. Emily insisted we come find you, she said, smiling. Emily shrugged, blushing a little. I wanted to say hi, she mumbled. And thank you. Henry chuckled. I think we've covered that a few times already. He teased gently. Emily grinned, her confidence blooming in that safe, familiar space. But we also wanted to tell you some news, Susan said, her eyes dancing. Henry arched a brow. Good news, I hope. Susan nodded. Emily starts school next week, she said proudly. Brookside Academy accepted her full-time. She's nervous but ready. Emily beamed, her hands fidgeting with a straw wrapper. And, Susan continued, she's going to join the writing club. Henry's eyebrows rose. Writing club, huh? Emily nodded, a little shyly. I like stories, she said, reading them, telling them. I thought, maybe I could learn to write my own. Henry smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. I think that's a wonderful idea, he said. Emily's voice grew a little stronger. And someday, maybe I'll write about people like you, about the ones who notice, the ones who help. Henry swallowed hard against the sudden lump in his throat. He cleared his throat, roughly. I'd be honored, he said. They talked for a while longer about school supplies and favorite books, and what flavor of ice cream Emily had decided was her new favorite. Cookie dough, she declared firmly. For the first time, Henry saw Susan laugh without the shadow of worry hanging over her shoulders. For the first time, he saw Emily light up when talking about the future, instead of folding inward. Eventually, Susan glanced at her watch and stood, gathering her purse. We've got to run, she said. Doctor's appointments and school meetings. Henry stood with them, reluctant to see them go but grateful for every moment they had shared. Susan reached out and hugged him tightly. I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough, she said against his shoulder. You don't have to, Henry said simply. Emily hugged him too, brief but fierce. See you around, Mr. Callahan, she said brightly. You bet, he replied. As they disappeared out the door, Henry sat back down, his coffee long since gone cold. But he didn't mind. He watched through the window as Susan and Emily walked down the sidewalk, their heads close together, laughing at some private joke. Life wasn't perfect. It never would be. There would be hard days, struggles yet to come. But there was light again. There was hope again. And Henry Callahan knew deep in his bones that sometimes the biggest miracles came in the smallest, quietest moments. Moments like a mother and daughter laughing under a late summer sky. Moments like a young girl, once broken, daring to dream again. Moments like a tired old bus driver sitting in a quiet cafe, realizing that he had made a difference that would last a lifetime. The school year at Brookside Academy started under a wide, cloudless sky. On that first morning, as buses lined up and backpacks bounced against skinny shoulders, Henry Callahan stood just beyond the sidewalk, leaning casually against his old Buick, watching. He wasn't driving a route today. He had asked for the day off, because today wasn't just about starting a new school year. It was about beginnings. real beginnings, the kind that were fought for, clawed back from the edge of despair, and rebuilt with trembling, determined hands. Henry spotted her almost immediately. Emily Parker stepped off the sidewalk, her uniform neat, her long brown hair braided down her back. Her new backpack swung at her side, patches carefully stitched onto the canvas books, stars, words like hope and strength. She looked around for a moment, taking in the bustle of students. Henry saw the hesitation flicker across her face, the memory of how hard new beginnings could be. Then Susan appeared, kneeling beside her daughter to adjust the strap of the backpack, smoothing Emily's braid, whispering something only they could hear. Whatever it was, it made Emily smile. A real smile, confident, whole. Henry's heart swelled with pride he couldn't put into words. Emily spotted him standing across the way. She didn't wave, she grinned, wide and unabashed, and pointed at her heart before pointing at him. Henry chuckled, touched a hand to his chest in return. Words weren't necessary. He understood. "Thank you, I'm okay, you mattered." Susan offered Henry a small, teary wave before ushering Emily toward the school doors. Henry watched them disappear into the building, a lump forming in his throat. It would never be perfect. Life never was, but Emily wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. She was growing. She was moving forward. And Henry Callahan, retired mechanic, part-time bus driver, unlikely guardian angel, had played a small, stubborn part in that. He climbed into his old Buick, the driver's seat creaking familiarly under his weight. The little keychain Emily had given him, colored beads spelling out, "Stay strong," swung lightly from the ignition as he turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. Henry smiled to himself as he pulled away from the curb, the morning sun casting long, hopeful shadows across the street. He didn't know what the road ahead would bring, but he knew this. When the world asked him to look away, he had chosen to pay attention. When fear said to stay silent, he had chosen to speak. When doubt whispered it wasn't his business, he had chosen to care. And somewhere out there, because of that, a young girl now had a future wide open in front of her. Sometimes, Henry thought, life gives you second chances when you least expect it. Sometimes, the smallest kindnesses ripple farther than you could ever imagine. And sometimes, when you simply refuse to look away, you change everything. Sometimes, the greatest act of courage is simply choosing to pay attention. Through Henry Callahan's quiet determination, we are reminded that noticing small signs of distress and refusing to look away can change a life forever. It's easy to assume that someone else will step in. It's easy to believe that problems are not ours to solve. But the truth is, sometimes the difference between despair and hope begins with one person willing to care. This story teaches us that small acts of vigilance, kindness, and persistence matter. In a world that often moves too fast, slowing down to truly see someone else's pain is a rare and powerful gift. For those of us who have lived long enough to understand life's weight, it's a call to remember. Our experience, our patience, our willingness to listen, these are strengths meant to be used. No one is ever too old to make a difference. And sometimes, by simply refusing to turn away, we become the very reason someone finds the courage to heal and begin again.